All right, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I think we already got a taste of how interesting and challenging these 2 days are going to be, so I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. How is our sound check and site check? Everything's going fine. I'm asked to tell you a little bit about what we know from the polling perspective. I do work for the Pew Research Center, and we're a little bit different as organizations go. We call ourselves a fact tank as opposed to a think tank because we are nonpartisan and non-advocacy. We're not here to be boosters for science. We don't take policy positions. Our role as an organization is to provide information about the key trends and issues shaping society. One of my roles today is to help us navigate some of the intricacies of polling methods, and there's a whole lot to know about that topic. How we go about conducting surveys has changed quite a lot over the past decades, and really continues to be in transition. The underlying principle has stayed exactly the same, which is that if you are looking to make estimates about what a population thinks or believes or feels, then you really need a probability-based sampling method to select a representative sample of the public. So we spend a lot of time and effort in thinking about how to best design that sample as well, and sometimes we're thinking not just about the overall sample and the overall estimates, but also about the quality of our estimates for subgroups in the population, because often you're interested in more than just the public as a whole, but you have key subgroups in mind. And my remarks today are really going to go beyond my work with Pew Research Center and draw from my background in social psychology and political science, where I began a career-long interest in understanding the public mind and how we form judgments. In the end, I wanted to cover kind of the best data we had related to trust in the life sciences, and I'm drawing, I don't know whether it's the best data, but I'm drawing on data that I had a role in collecting when I was working at Virginia Commonwealth Universities, and I directed the life sciences surveys there. And they are a national survey that doesn't exist anymore, focused on biotech issues. So you'll see some of that data that you may not have been aware of before. And then I will also be drawing as a poll consumer and a data analyst on work especially by the General Social Survey, most of which was collected on behalf of the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. Okay, trust in science. I don't know if this is the best analogy, but like the Holy Grail, it does seem to be something that's universally sought and perhaps somewhat elusive to gain. Trust, something everybody wants. We all want more of it. Trust in government, we've watched ebb and flow over decades, mostly ebb in recent years. Trust in the media, also at remarkably low levels. Trust in the criminal justice system, possibly on trial now in Baltimore and around the country. So that actually speaks to us about one reason why you might want to have a 2-day workshop on trust in science, which is simply that we know it pays to be mindful of trust before it gets that bad, because it's much easier to destroy and essentially erode trust than it is to build it back up after it has eroded. And really that comes from a fundamental principle that we think informs judgment all the time in terms of the asymmetry of negative information compared to positive information. So the analogy is simply like, for positive information is like drips of water in a bucket. The accumulation of water is treated like a reservoir of goodwill, and it's goodwill for positive expectations about our future interactions. And then that wave of negative information comes along and it can just dump out that whole reserve. And sometimes when it's really bad, it can kind of leave a slick residue where you can't even accumulate new positive drips of information. That's why we want to be here before it gets that bad, and we're going to look at the data and kind of evaluate how bad is it. We'll see some good news and some bad news in that. Obviously, most of the time we're simplifying. A lot of times we're simplifying when we talk about science, and we talk about trust in terms of people. We often use the model of people. I think we want to try to use the model of actors so that we can immediately start to realize that the actors involved in science is a huge collection of people, groups, institutions, governmental and non-governmental institutions. But we will simplify just to help us keep moving along with our mental models and then back it out into more complexity as we need to. This is the single most common set of data that we look at when we ask questions about how much trust is there in science. And it comes from the General Social Survey. It's collected since 1973. The latest data here is from 2012. They've actually collected 2014, but it comes out in January of 2016. So what we see here is just 2 of the roughly 12 or 13 institutions that are rated on a 3-point scale. Medicine is on basically the top line, darker line, and over time that's a linear decline in public trust, that they have a great deal of confidence in the people running these institutions. It's a slow linear decline, but the high was 61. It was more commonly around 55-ish, and is down hovering around 40, 41 in the past couple of cycles. The scientific community actually stands out for a different reason, and that is the relatively flat line that it shows over time. So I'm drawing in this analysis from an analysis by the principal investigator of the social surveys, Tom Smith, and his colleague, and he talks about, on average, a linear decline across the 12 or 13 institutions from the mid-70s to 2012. So there's been overall a decline in trust in institutions. There's an exception there, which is trust in the military, and the leaders of the military has gone up, and we see that in other data as well. Confidence in the press and TV, we saw that tank in these data. And then, as I mentioned, the trust in the scientific community is if everything else is going down and trust in the scientific community is flat, well, okay, that's a relatively good piece of news. There is other analysis of this exact same data that suggests that there might be some decline among subgroups of the population. We can come back to that. There is also a very well-known series of data collected by Gallup on confidence in institutions, but let me just remind you, they don't have an indicator there of science, which is why we don't talk about it today. It does show some of the same patterns. Military goes up, and a lot of other institutions goes down over time. Okay, so from that is where we get a lot of chit-chat about how you really shouldn't be too worried about trust. Trust doesn't look to be on the decline over time when you have a nice set of data to look at that with controlled comparisons. On the other hand, since we did promise bad news, on the other hand, one of the most common patterns that we also see when we look at public attitudes has to do with what I've called ambivalence about science. And this is just one measure to show us that. This is from a series of telephone surveys, 2001 through 2009-10. And you just see remarkable divide over whether or not you agree or disagree that scientific research has created as many problems for society as solutions. So there's 2 kind of common patterns when you look at public attitudes about science. One is that overall, in attitudes about science writ large, we often see really positive views, that there's a overwhelming majority seeing positive benefits of science to society, that a majority see benefits from government funding in science, that often you see a majority optimistic about continued scientific innovation. But at the same time, you also see this ambivalence. And then, as we know, that when you turn to attitudes about more particular, we usually call them like specific science topics, there's not usually a good label. We'll talk about things like genetically modified foods, things like genetic research. When you turn to those topics, you often see more divide, and certainly attitudes are more varied, less predictable. We can't expect to see that same kind of positive. So we'll keep that in mind as we go around. Now, in preparation for the workshop today, most of the presenters either read or reread a handful of readings so that we would have a kind of common points of reference when we think about trust. And as you know, there's really a huge literature related to trust across different disciplines. And so this is helpful, and I just pulled out a couple of these kind of ways to think about trust from those readings. And they're somewhat abstract. The first 2, I think, go hand in hand, that trust is basically a standing decision to give someone else, and here we'd have to expand beyond the idea of people to give other actors, essentially, the benefit of the doubt. That comes from a study done at the time of a decline in government trust and a focus on the role of interpersonal trust in those relationships. And the second is, I think, a related concept. David Resnick summarizes a huge literature, I think, aptly, talking about trust being a relationship among people, or here expand to actors. And it's used to facilitate future cooperative social interactions. And because it's about the future, it's always going to involve some risk and uncertainty about what those future actions will be. And let me just actually pause there and remind me to come back to the third one. Those two, I think, go together. They're kind of abstract. I think they fit relatively well with how we often talk about trust. So, for example, we trust about the government to do what's right. Well, that's kind of a general expectation for the future interaction that we have with the institutions of government, perhaps based on a sense of perceived motives behind those institutions or the goals of government. We talk about the trust in government to fix the problems of society. Again, I think an example of our general expectation for future interactions. We talk about trusting government to treat people fairly. I think another example that we have these expectations for the future interaction, and that we can use that same thinking as we think about trust in science. Trust defined as a set of expectations between this broad, amorphous collection of people, groups, and institutions. And then trust, thinking in these ways, is really a framework that's designed to be positive. Essentially, it's normatively a good thing. If you could have very reliable expectations for future interactions, and if they're bad, it's called distrust. Okay, so that's just inherent in how we think about it. And I think what I like about it is that the idea that these definitions are connecting the idea of risk with trust, that it raises the idea that we're thinking about those two things together, because our expectations for future interactions are meaningful when they concern these elements where we feel at risk. And so we're going to come back to thinking about what are public perceptions of risk and kind of how that ties in. Now, the bottom definition, I think, is really the most narrow. It's a little bit different. Talking about the trust or credibility of a messenger delivering information comes especially from a large literature starting in the 50s, roughly, on persuasion and how we understand attitudes and how to change beliefs or behaviors. I think it's one piece of what we mean when we talk about trust, but it's not a piece that really speaks to the idea of the two-way dialogue or concept behind public engagement with science. So I think it's one thing to keep in mind. We use it a lot in literature. It's important for different reasons, but I think not quite as broad as the others. Now, one more thing to point out about this slide, and that's what's missing, okay? I do not see a definition in the literature that says trust is about thinking like me. Often you hear that when people are talking in less precise terms. They look at the data. To them, they see a very clear-cut position, and they ask, why doesn't the public think more like where I see scientific consensus? I don't see that as being trust. That's not what I would define as trust. So I would just, I know that if you hold that position, I would encourage you to think for 2 days in a different framework and see where it takes you. I'm going to get you going on data here. This is the only piece of data I could find that I really had that came close to the idea of trust as the source of credible information. I think it might have more than one thing in there, but that I think is part of what it's measuring. This was done in 2001 at the beginning when we were talking about embryonic stem cell research. And we did a whole series of rating of trust of different actors, essentially, for providing information about stem cell research. And overall, I think, you know, the scientific and medical researchers, I believe it had an extra phrase, working in this area or something, they came out pretty well relative to the other groups. Below that, specialists in medical ethics. And of course, you know, near the bottom, members of Congress, the media, President Bush, not too surprising there. You know, in my analysis of that, we do often see skews in the data, and I did focus on the kind of combination between a lot and a little. If you're worried about kind of the size of that share saying a lot, you might say, how come people aren't even more strong in their concept that, yes, you can really rely on the information by these groups. it might suggest a kind of wary public at times. And remember, that was a fairly long time ago. And then often when we talk about trust, we move to trust in the people doing science. So trust in motivations. The top one is probably, I don't know, it might be a little bit of my own mind about it, but to me, if you have a rating, do you agree or disagree that scientists are helping to solve challenging problems? It speaks to the expectations the public might hold about what science is doing, and that might tie into our concept of trust. And they're 95%, I think, either strongly agreeing or agreeing that scientists are helping to solve challenging problems. That looks really positive. Below it, scientific researchers are dedicated people who work for the good of humanity, 88% agreeing with that statement. So again, that's very, I think, positive overall assessments of kind of the motivations of scientists. This is a series that we did at Pew Research Center that is, I think, similar. These are ratings of different occupational groups. How much does each group contribute? A lot to society's well-being. This is a 4-point rating. And I think similar to what we saw on the other slide, that there tends to be a relatively large share of the public saying good things about what scientists, medical doctors, and engineers do for society. Relative to other occupational groups, even more say good things about the military, even more say good things about teachers. But those 3 occupations come right below, and then there's kind of a stair step below that when it comes to the clergy. And of course, lawyers are there at the bottom. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Then we want to look at the data collected on the General Social Survey, which is one of our only remaining in-person surveys. And these are items that were developed by the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. A group of people, I think, advised them about how to go about this. These were collected in 2010. And they did a series of kind of parallel areas to be able to get at attitudes in different topical areas. So genetically modified foods, stem cell research, global warming, nuclear power, to have a comparison with engineers. And then they were comparing, these are 5-point ratings. Let's see, did I explain that? These are 5-point ratings. The mean is what I'm showing you there. And basically the endpoints are labeled. How much do you think each of these groups would do what is best for the country as a whole versus serves their own narrow interests? So this is very clearly getting at the concept of motives for each of these groups. And the top bar is motives of a science or engineering group. The top ones for genetically modified foods are medical researchers as compared with elected officials and business leaders. Stem cell research, again, comparing medical researchers with elected officials or religious leaders. Global warming, environmental scientists with elected officials or business leaders. And nuclear power, comparing nuclear engineers with elected officials or business leaders. And in every case, relative to elected officials and business leaders or religious leaders, the perception of motive there, I think, looks very positive for these science and engineering groups, that overall people are leaning towards the idea that they tend to do what is best for the country. Now, I took the same data on the top bar, and I added a different rating of the science or engineering group on the second bar. And the questions are a little bit different for the 4 different topic areas, so I'll just walk you through it. For genetically modified foods, the underbar is a rating on a 5-point scale of how much they understand the risks of genetically modified foods. So from understanding very well to not at all, with the mean being shown there. The stem cell research is just their degree of understanding, kind of with no real qualifier. The global warming is their degree of understanding of the causes of global warming. And nuclear power is their understanding about the likely effects of nuclear power. So that is certainly one possibility of why you see different mean ratings across those 4 groups could be related to the different wording. But I'm thinking about that as the top bar, a measure of motives and perceived motives of these groups. And the second bar, this idea of their understanding, to me, speaks to the idea that we trust these groups we basically trust the expertise of these groups to answer these questions. And what would concern me is how come it's not the same pattern on all four? It's like the two where 4.2 versus 3.7, like that's the pattern I'd expect to see, even stronger perceptions of kind of the expertise and understanding of these expert groups relative to their motive. And the question is, does the fact that you see kind of an even rating on genetically modified foods and global warming kind of suggest areas where public perceptions are a little less trusting? Okay. I'm going to shift you back to some data from VCU Life Sciences surveys. If we want to think about trust, we might want to think about it in connection with our perceived risks. And we did a lot of questions about genetic testing. There were a number of things that we asked that led up to this, but two things where we asked people to rate the likelihood of different things happening from genetic testing. One is health insurance companies denying people coverage, of which, fair number, 57% thought that was very likely, or employers denying people jobs, where 34% thought that was very likely. And then the follow-up is a series of ratings about different groups and your confidence that each of those could protect people from the misuse of genetic information. I mean, the misuse is open-ended, but because they're right before you evaluate all those perceived risks, I'm thinking that is part of what you're thinking about when you're thinking about misuse of genetic information. And so these are, a lot of different groups are rated. Again, the kind of expert groups, physicians, genetic counselors, scientists doing genetic research, look better than some of the other groups. We did literally use, I think, the word consumer watchdog groups. Government, but whether state or federal, comes there in the middle. Pharmaceuticals, employers, health insurance companies, journalists, reporters down near the bottom. And I think, again, you see the relative order of the groups in a way that you might expect. But if you're worried about the kind of absolute shares that basically only 23% said they were very confident physicians could protect people from the misuse of genetic information, et cetera, then you might also be seeing some wariness on the part of the public. All right, and then we had, from several years later, we had done other questions about genetic research, and this is another perception of risk. This one is where we offered the people those three choices. What is your main concern when you think about the risks of conducting genetic research? Too little is known about how to conduct genetic research safely is the most common response of the three options, 38%. And again, what that speaks to me about is this idea that there might be some wariness about how much these expert groups really know, and this idea of trust in their expertise being a little shaky. Often when we talk about risks and concerns, we turn to the government and say, hey, is the government a tool from which we could protect ourselves from risk? And this is a 5-point agree-disagree statement about that. Rules set by government will keep us safe from any risks linked to modern genetic science. I know that I took that from one of these surveys done in the UK, but I can't exactly, I didn't look up which one. And it was, I'd say striking here is the 57%, 53% saying they disagree that the rules set by government will keep us safe from any risk. So the idea that we don't really trust government could be an issue as we look to government as a source of protections from potential risks within the scientific enterprise. And this slide makes that quite explicit. This is a general question about whether government regulation of scientific research is necessary to protect the public interest or usually does more harm than good. And so the overall results on top, 46% saying regulation is necessary, 39% saying usually does more harm than good. The two bars below is a crosstab of people based on their general trust in government, federal government. And the reason those 76 and 41 don't come close to averaging 46 is because the share of the population that says good things, that you can trust the government always or most of the time, is very small relative to the share that says only some of the time, right? So among this smaller subset that says you can trust government always or most of the time, you know, they are much more likely to say government regulation is necessary, right? So trust. So the idea here is certainly our trust in government in general is linked to our views about government regulation. And then turning back to some of the data from the General Social Survey, this is a series of 7 environmental risks that people rate on a 5-point scale. And what's especially wonderful about this data is that they did this as part of the International Survey Program, so there is data over decades on these same risks. This is the only area of the 7 where in 2010 we saw a change in perceived risk, and it was, of course, an increase in perceived risk from pesticides and chemicals used in farming. Now, the question is about risk to the environment, I will say. All the questions were about risk to the environment. But then in our most recent survey, we talked about risk to ourselves and our health from pesticides that perhaps speaks to the same kind of concerns there, with the majority of adults saying that eating these foods is generally unsafe. We see women particularly likely to say that. There's some difference by education, but even those with a postgraduate degree, 6 in 10, say that generally eating foods grown with pesticides is unsafe. You also perhaps remember that we also found that a majority of the public says that eating foods that have been genetically modified is generally unsafe. And you see the same patterns there, especially by gender, and even stronger patterns by education. But this is what I really am getting to, where we also had 3 or 4 questions about genetically modified foods. And this one, I think, again, speaks to trust and really shows some signs of distrust. People rated just a 2-point question whether scientists generally have a clear understanding or do not have a clear understanding about the health effects of genetically modified crops. And I was surprised to see 67% of the public saying no, they don't have a clear understanding, and no difference there by education where you might expect it. Again, I think that speaks to the idea that perceptions of the expertise of these of scientists working in this area are not probably what you wanted them to be. So what we've done here is look at data from these different perspectives. What do we know about perceptions of trust to provide reliable information? I didn't have very much to show you, but there I think scientists and other experts tend to come out pretty well. We saw several places where I think of them as trust in measures of expertise to get answers or to know about risks, and we see some signs that the public is not quite convinced, I guess, and has a lot of skepticism about that. We saw measures of trust in the motives of scientists, the people doing science, and those tended to be more positive. We didn't have any data about trust in the incentives of their institutions, but this is also important in that you can perceive wonderful motives of the individuals, but if you also see them as working in institutions or in basically in a broader social structure that has incentives for essentially unethical behavior, then you could see good people doing bad things. There might be concerns about pressures of commercialization, profit making, and so on that raise those kinds of concerns. And then we come to the idea of, can we trust the safeguards to prevent those kinds of incentives from operating? And lastly, we saw a number of different kinds of data that really speak to the idea that when we're thinking about trust, and we're thinking it might be connected to particular risks in these particular domains, and we'd have to understand better what the perceived risks are, and then that suggests where we would go to look for the perceptions of trust to protect us from those particular risks. So I hope this helps to get our collective thoughts going. And I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker and see where this conversation takes us. Thank you so much. You will help me.
We have time for a couple of questions. Cary, if you're willing to take that, and then Cary will also join a panel later on in the morning. So any further questions, comments? Please use the microphone.
So, you raised an interesting question about the confidence in the military, right, which is very high. versus the confidence in researchers. So the question is, what happens when the military does research?
When the military does research.
Right, so I'll give you an example. In April, DARPA launched the Biological Technologies Office. So they've essentially put together almost every piece in DARPA that does anything related to the life sciences, cognitive neuroscience, synthetic biology, huge investments. Is this good or bad? They'll have money. They'll probably have more money to invest than a lot of the traditional agencies. People from Europe look at this and say, is the US weaponizing biology, right? But it raises this bigger issue that you raised, is sort of, what if the research is done by the military, right? Because that's something that's constantly happening in the US. And some of the investments are much larger than the investments that are going to be made by NSF or NIH. And I don't know whether we have any data on that at all, but it'd be interesting to see whether people trust researchers in a military context doing life science research.
Right, I think that's really interesting. We have a panel coming up that talks about the intersection of government and science, and it's the same issue, really. You know, if you have kind of a standing, more negative view of government and you connect that with scientific research, does that somehow taint it? And you're just doing the opposite here when we think about the military. I don't really know the answer to that. I think it's a great question for empirical research. There might be more data out there. I think what we see in terms of that public confidence in the military, and we do see it a lot of times in these different ratings where you talk about different groups. We see, you know, the idea that the military is contributing to society, that we have confidence overall in the military, that are, you know, our most recent ratings where you rated different domains of society and institutions in terms of whether it was the best in the world or above average or about average or below average. Again, the military was at the top of public perceptions. But I think we could probably drill down and do the same thing that we do with science and talk about different aspects of the military, and we might see more varied, you know, more varied attitudes there, so that when you are combining something about military-based research, I don't know, it could be, you know, it could definitely be positive or negative or more mixed kinds of reactions. So I think it's a great area to think about. I know we had a question here.
Anything else? Excellent, Cary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So Cary's